So I'm Barbara Long and I'm going to be here at the Fresh Air Sculpture show this June and I'm looking forward to it. So I think that probably all art comes out of chaos in some way or another, and I'm no different really. I think as a child I always made a lot of mess, and I've carried on making a lot of mess. And I try and sort through my mess to make some sense of it and create works that are authentic to me and have some coherence that otherwise, unless you work through your mess, you never find. And I suppose I refer to mess in many respects, in the material way, in the fact that my studio is always full of mess. My house is quite full of mess, like a lot of people's. I think we're creating way too much mess in the environment. And I think we've got a lot of mess in our heads, insides. And I suppose a lot of my work is a way of processing that mess and trying to give it some sense. And I guess bring it into a whole. So for me, I think one of the really important things about my artwork is that process is really important. I think process in all artwork is important. And I like my works to show the evidence of that process. So I like the stitches that I make to be very evident. I even like the mistakes I make along the way to be evident. I like the darning I do to be clearly darning, that nothing is totally finished. In fact, I would say that none of my artworks are ever totally finished. They're always in process. And in fact, I never give my work a name or a date until it's left, till someone's bought it, because I feel that unless someone's bought it, then it's always likely that I'm going to give it another turn, as a turn of the mill, as it were, or do something else with it. And also I like to introduce very domestic processes, darning, sewing, mending. Even some of my works involve quite a lot of ironing, which I hate as it happens, because I think as women our domestic processes are very much part of our lives, in too much part of our lives as it happens and have been. And I suppose I bring that into my art because I want to make that patently clear and give evidence to that aspect of women's lives. I mean, my art is very much about women's lives and women. It's art. You could say it's feminist art or art that's, I don't know how else to describe it. I don't like describing my art, I have to say. I don't like pinning it down. I think that I'm in that territory that's somewhere between craft and art. I'm in a territory that's sometimes it's between sculpture and 2D. Sometimes I like that sort of middle territory that is less easily definable. Yes, I think the natural world has been a source of inspiration to me all through my artistic career. And I started off actually working very much doing drawings and sketches and paintings of the natural world. I continue to sketch a lot, not as much as I'd like to, but I do still continue to sketch. I like a lot of my work actually is designed to be hung outside or involves natural materials that can easily incorporate into an outside setting. It's part of what we're surrounded by, isn't it, if we're lucky enough to not live in a big city. And even when we live in a big city, I think the natural spaces around us are really important. And yeah, the natural world has been a constant throughout my career and has been a constant inspiration. My work is very personal. I incorporate a lot of personal material in my life, and by that I mean material in terms of fabric. So I incorporate old dusters from my mother. I like to incorporate elements and material that are often overlooked, such as old holey dusters or bits of sheet that have been used as dusters, or old nappies, or old bits of material that I've used for mopping up the studio. And in fact, I think that a lot of that comes from the idea that so often I find that what I'm not doing or what I'm discarding is so much more interesting than actual fact what I'm trying to do, that then I incorporate them into my work. So an old stained bit of rag that I've been using to mop up some of my paint is usually much more interesting than the painting I'm doing. And I think that's where that impulse came from. So the other aspect to my art, which is really important to me, is that I like my artwork to be totally interactive. I like people to be able to touch it, to even get inside it, to feel it. I don't like my art to be something that's stuck there that people feel they can't approach. And I think that's part of everything I'm trying to do in my art, is that I like my art to be very approachable. That also has to do with me using everyday materials. The materials I use are materials that we all have in our houses, generally speaking, or we can find in a skip down the road. So in that sense, they're works that everyone, if they want to, can try out doing something similar, which is great. So the global pandemic, I think for a lot of artists, has actually benefited them in some ways, because they've had more time to be in the studio, and I'm no different in that sense. Curiously enough, before the pandemic started, I was becoming quite obsessed with cocoon-like structures and refuge-like structures. Part of that's to do with my work with refugees as an art therapist, but who knows? They often say that art comes before life, doesn't it? Don't they? And I think, of course, in another sense, the pandemic's affected me a lot, in that living in Spain, I haven't been able to visit my family in the UK, and I've very much sought to find ways through my art to connect with my family, and particularly with my mother, who is blind. So I haven't been able to have the Zoom calls, for example, that other people have had. But what I have been able to do is to produce structures that she can touch and that she can even identify the fabrics of. And so I'm able to send her bits of structure that my sister can allow her to fiddle with. And that's been a way of connecting with her and connecting her to my art as well. So that, in a sense, it sounds awful to say it, but in a sense, the global pandemic has sort of driven my art even further, and made me, I've had to seek new ways of expressing myself in every way, not just artistically.